Hi, and welcome to the Working Songwriter, the show where today's best songwriters come to talk shop. I'm your host, Joe Pug. Each episode here, we host a distinguished guest, and we ask them to go deep on their inspiration, on their process, on the general ups and downs of making a life in music. So, whether you're a grizzled veteran, wearing a Billie Eilish t-shirt to impress your nephew, or else a scrappy upstart, wearing a vintage Jayhawks t-shirt to impress your uncle, this is your show. Because ultimately, it is what every writer seeks most, an ironclad excuse to put off actually writing. Hey guys, it's Friday, August 7th, 2020, and I thank you for joining us. This week's show is brought to you by Bandzoogle. Built by musicians and for musicians, Bandzoogle is an all-in-one platform to build a beautiful website for your music. I'm old enough to remember when you had to pay somebody called a web developer to get a website made. And it would always be some guy named Klaus who drove a Mini Cooper with racing stripes and a Godsmack bumper sticker on the back, and who tried to sell you balloons filled with nitrous oxide. And old Klaus would charge you about $1,000 for a website that would be obsolete in 6 months. But it's the future now, you guys. That's not how it works anymore. We're allowed to have nice things now. One of those nice things is Bandzoogle. Bandzoogle powers the websites of tens of thousands of musicians around the world, from weekend warriors to Grammy winners. Everything you need is built in. Hosting and a custom domain name, dozens of fully customizable design templates, tools to sell your merch commission-free, mailing list tools, social media integrations, the ability to crowdfund your next project commission-free. It's a wonderful service. The Working Songwriter podcast listeners can go to bandzoogle.com to try it for free for 30 days. And just use the promo code TWS, the initials of our show, to get 15% off the first year of any subscription. If you'd like to hear some of my music live in the coming months, every Sunday night at 9 p.m. Eastern, I'll be live over at YouTube for Sunday Songs. That means I'll be playing some tunes of mine. I'll be playing a few of other people's songs that I love. I'll be answering questions from the live chat. I'll be taking requests from the live chat. It's a very interactive experience between myself and the viewers with one another, many of whom are listeners of this podcast. We've started to build a little community over there on Sunday nights. It's really fun. I hope you can come join us. Just head over to YouTube, search for Joe Pug's channel, subscribe there, and we will see you there Sunday night at 9 p.m. Eastern. Last bit of housekeeping here. If you enjoy this podcast, if you'd like to help it remain a viable endeavor for me, there's a couple things that you could do to help. Firstly, you could become a supporter of the show over at Patreon. Patreon is a platform that allows you to directly support a creative endeavor that you love. You just head to their site, Patreon, Patreon. You search for The Working Songwriter, or you search for my name, and then you sign up to kick in a few bucks every month. Think of it as a voluntary subscription. If just 1% of our listenership would kick in the price of a cup of coffee every month, it would make a huge difference for me. So thanks for all the people that have taken the time to do that. If you're not in a position where you can contribute that way, that's all good. I've been there before, financially. There's a couple things that you could do for free that would help. First, you could leave us a rating in the iTunes store, or secondly, you could just tell a friend. The simple math on those two things is that they will help me much more than they will be a pain in the ass for you. Okay, I'll end all the harassment there. Lucinda Williams is a legend. My wife and I have been to see her in concert many times. I'm a huge fan. This was a bucket list interview for me, so thank you to Jim Flamia over at All Eyes Media for making this happen, and obviously thanks to Miss Lucinda Williams herself. I hope you guys enjoy it very much. Our guest this week is a fixture of American music who is firmly in the conversation of best songwriter of her generation. Lucinda Williams grew up all around the American South, Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, Arkansas, where her father, the acclaimed poet Miller Williams, had taken work teaching literature at universities. After spending many years in the regional Texas music scene and then Los Angeles, her music made its first national impression when Mary Chapin Carpenter covered her song Passionate Kisses, which went to the top of the country charts and also netted Miss Williams a Grammy for Best Country Song. Her late career breakthrough album, Car Wheels on a Gravel Road, became a gold record and made her a household name. She's recorded for Smithsonian Folkways, Mercury Records, Lost Highway, Rough Trade, and more recently, her very own label, Highway 20 Records. She's appeared on Late Night with David Letterman, Saturday Night Live, and pretty much any late night show that you could name. She's been nominated for 15 Grammys and won 3. She's been nominated for 12 Americana Music Awards and won a pair of them. VH1 ranked her as one of their, quote, 100 greatest women in rock and roll, unquote. Personally, I think you could have just left that at 100 greatest people in rock and roll, but what do I know? The New York Times has described her music as such. She's pithy and penetrating, bruised but steadfast, proud of the grain and drawl of her voice. Her music places itself in a vanishing, idealized Southland where country, soul, blues, and gospel all share a common spirit and a vocabulary of twang, and where life lessons can be delivered by a bar band. And NPR has said of her work, Williams crafts words and melodies that seem to originate in the listener's own head, capturing the way stray observations and building reveries intertwine to become the stories we tell ourselves and each other. I was able to catch up with her on the phone last week to hear about her journey so far. Miss Lucinda Williams, thank you so much for being a part of the Working Songwriter podcast. Talk to me a little bit about the cultural milieu. Growing up in Louisiana, what sort of music and culture were you exposed to growing up?
Well, I lived in Louisiana part of the time I was growing up, but I guess my more formative years were spent there, in junior high and high school, and that was where I first started playing guitar and, really listening to discovering albums and when I first discovered Bob Dylan and everything. So a lot of it was, just like other kids, listening to albums and hearing stuff on the radio and stuff. But other than that, as far as the cultural atmosphere, musically living in New Orleans, of course, there was a lot of traditional jazz and that sort of thing, I remember my dad used to take us down to this place called Preservation Hall, where there were some, old musicians playing there and, and just, all the New Orleans kind of music. I mean, there really wasn't much of a contemporary music scene there or singer-songwriter type scene, like I discovered later in Austin, when I went to Austin, Texas in 1974. And, I spent 10 years in Texas, so Austin and Houston. And that was when I was in my 20s. So that was really when I started playing out, getting gigs and that sort of thing. But actually, my first gig was in New Orleans. I have to back up a little bit. That's right. My very first gig was on Bourbon Street it was a folk singer-songwriter bar, which happened to also be on Bourbon Street, which was real odd. But I was up there for the summer visiting. We'd already moved from there, but I've gone back to visit my mother because after my parents split up, she still stayed there. And I got my first gig for tips at this place.
Right on.
And,
Go ahead.
so I was going to say the tips could be pretty good because it was right on Bourbon Street, so the tourists would come in and stuff. But anyway.
You mentioned your father was taking you to those Preservation Hall gigs. Your father was the celebrated poet poet, Miller Williams.
Yeah.
As a kid, how aware were you of his creative side, and what sort of impact did his creative path have on yours?
Well, I mean, it was huge, the impact. And yes, I was very aware of it. And, I mean, it was a special world to grow up in, as a kid and then later as a teenager and everything. I got to meet a lot of amazing writers and, who were friends of my dad's, and they would come through town. And, the poetry world is a pretty small world, really. And, we lived in college towns all the time because my dad would teach, as a poet, he taught also, creative writing and everything. And so, different poets would come to town and give readings, and they were always college towns. And then after the reading, one of the local writers would host a party at his house, and it was usually at my dad's house. And those parties were really, pretty mind-opening for a teenager, just hanging out with all these writers. And, it was either at a party with a bunch of people after a reading, or sometimes, a couple of the writers would come over to the house and we'd just sit around. And, people like John Clellan Holmes, he was one of the beat writers, and James Dickey, who wrote Deliverance, and so those are the. I grew up with those kinds of minds around me, which were, needless to say, amazingly inspiring. And I was real close to my dad and really looked up to him, and I'm really a lot like him, so I kind of wanted to follow in his footsteps, except I went into the music part of things. And, because I just fell in love with Bob Dylan and Leonard Cohen and, different singer-songwriters and blues and stuff. But my dad was really into blues and jazz, and, he would go and buy. He was really into this Bessie Smith album that came out on Columbia in the 70s. And, he was going to the record stores and buying stuff, Lightning Hawkins and everything. He listened to Coltrane and Chet Baker. And so, he was a big music lover, too.
What was his reaction to you choosing music as a vocation? Was he worried for you because, music is kind of a hard way to make a buck? Was he excited? Yeah,
I'll bet. Supportive. Yeah, he was supportive, probably like a lot of parents like him. I mean, my dad was he was an artist, he was a poet, he was a very progressive thinker, in his outlooks and in his viewpoints. But at the same time, he was, from that era where having a college education was the number one most important thing. And, basically, he wanted me to have something to fall back on. He was very supportive of my music, but he really wanted me to stay in college, and get a degree in something, which would have been, and he was right about that. I mean, if this music thing hadn't worked out, I don't know what I would have done, because I really didn't have any other skills, Yeah. I went to college for about a couple of semesters at the University of Arkansas, and my major was actually going to be cultural anthropology, if you can believe that. And probably from all the traveling around we did in other countries and everything, I was real interested in different cultures and all that, But, I just got taken away and, seduced by the allure of traveling on my own and going out on my own and playing music and stuff. I mean, that's all I wanted to do, really. Yeah. That was not only, my main focus, but I'm glad. I mean, I was lucky. I kind of tossed the dice and and it worked out. But I totally understand why my dad felt like that. Because he didn't want me to have to go through what he went through and everything. As a poet and struggling and all that. So. But he was very supportive. I mean, I remember after I got that first gig in New Orleans, I was just on cloud nine, and I called my dad. It was during the summer, and I was supposed to go back to Fayetteville to go back to school in the fall. And I told my dad I'd got this gig, and I said, I don't want to come back and go back to school in the fall. I want to stay here and do this. And he said, okay, if that's what you want to do. I often look at that as a big turning point.
Sure.
What would have happened had he said no, come back and go to school? But I think he knew. I was a rebel at heart.
Right on.
So he knew I was going to do that anyway. But I wanted his approval. So
no, I feel it. I'm pretty close with my father myself, and I know the feeling. I'd probably go off and do my own thing,
yeah.
but you do want to hear them say, "Yeah, I believe in you," and go for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, definitely.
So that left turn then from not going back to college, that took you via Central Texas. You mentioned that you cut your teeth in the singer-songwriter world. In Austin. Can you kind of describe the music scene or the scene in general and in Austin at that time?
Yeah. It was really great. I mean, a friend of mine had gone there ahead of me and, told me about it. And he said, you got to come check this place out. It's amazing. It's wonderful. There's music everywhere. And that was in 1974. And so I went, and somehow I made some connections through somebody. I don't know, through a friend of a friend of a friend. How...
Yeah.
You're that age, and they put me up. I slept on their couch and, in this house with some other roommates and started going down to the drag. They called it the drag. It was right by the college off of Guadalupe.
Mm-hmm.
There was a little couple of block area there where it was kind of like a little flea market area. And I used to go down there and, open my guitar case and stand and sing, and I had so much drive and ambition. I mean, it was just, you had to to do all that,
Definitely.
And but anyway, yeah, it was a real magical place. Just in terms of, there are a lot of hippies. That's what they used to call them. It's sort of like when people went to San Francisco, I think. A little bit like that, kind of like it was a real scene, and the rest of Texas wasn't like that at all. But here was this, pocket, in Austin, Texas, and it was just, they called them. There are all kinds of long hair rednecks, cosmic cowboys,
Yeah.
And this kind of crossover music, kind of country blended with psychedelic or whatever, and it was just all kinds of stuff. The 13th floor elevators, and then there was Rusty Weir and Gary P. Nunn, and all those kinds of bands like that, and it was super cheap to live, and there was just that whole grassroots kind of thing going on.
Besides playing at that flea market, did you end up playing? Were you playing like a circuit of clubs down there? And what clubs were they?
Yeah, it's whatever places I could. I remember there was this place on Guadalupe called the Hole in the Wall. It's still there.
It is, yeah.
And I remember the guy promised me a gig one month. And I walked by the club one day, and I saw that the calendar was all filled up. He had it taped to the outside of the door. And I was really upset and bummed out. And I confronted him after that and said, what happened? You said you were going to give me a gig this month. And he said, well, I figured I had enough chick singers for the month. you know, that kind of thing. So, yeah, there's still that, macho Texas thing that seeps through,
There is, but I'd imagine that
um,
back then it was even more.
yeah, yeah. But anyway, it was tough because I was just starting out. I mean, nobody knew who I was or anything. And then I started going to, the scene kind of changed in Austin. It kind of went from into, they wanted all these, cosmic cowboy bands, like the ones I mentioned, Gary P. Nunn and that kind of stuff, as opposed to a solo singer-songwriter thing,
Mm-hmm.
And there were these clubs in Houston that had opened up that I started hearing about, and I started driving over to Houston to do gigs over there because it was only a couple hours away. And one of them was this place, Anderson Fair, which was, ended up being this legendary, folk music place.
Right.
In Houston. And then there was a scattering of other little bars that hired singer-songwriters. And it was a really, and they were all kind of close together in this one area called Montrose, which is kind of near downtown. And, so that proved to be a lot more, lucrative and a lot more, just stuff kind of going on more there that, fit with me, with what I was doing.
Got it.
And, that was where, artists like Nancy Griffith were, she was getting started, and Lyle Lovett would drive over from College Station, and he was playing at Anderson Fair, opening up, for other artists like Eric Taylor and Richard Dobson, and there's this whole slew of people who came through there. And so I ended up living in Houston for a few years, and and then I moved back to Austin in '81.
Yeah.
Until I moved to LA.
And then
so
you
I was
kind
bouncing
of,
around all over.
but you were able to kind of rise out of that scene when you released your first couple albums, certainly the first one, maybe the first two on Smithsonian Folkways. In retrospect, that's like a perfect fit for your music, but it seems like at the time that was sort of a more untraditional route for a label, for a songwriter from Texas. How did you end up with Folkways?
Well, it's funny. I had a friend of mine from New Orleans, or who I think I met him when I was in New Orleans that summer when I got that gig at Andy's, and he was a singer-songwriter and he ended up moving to New York, and we were talking on the phone. And this is before I moved to. Anyway, at some point. It's hard when it's that long ago to put all the pieces together.
I feel it.
But anyway, to make a long story short, he had made an album for Folkways somehow or another, and his name was Jeff Ampolsk. I can't believe I remember his name. And the name of the album was God, Guts, and Guns. And so, he said, we're on the phone, and he said, look, you can make an album for Folkways. And I said, really? And he said, yeah, just send him a cassette tape and, and go from there. And so he gave me the information, and I sent a cassette tape to Mo Ash, who was still, the original guy.
Wow.
Folkways. He was still alive. Yeah. He was getting up there, though. But anyway, so I sent him this cassette tape, and at the time, I knew what Folkways Records was because I'd grown up listening to all the Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, Peggy Seeger albums on all this stuff on Folkways. They were, legendary. So I was aware of them. I already knew what they were, and I figured, kind of out of respect, or whatever, I don't know. I guess maybe I wasn't secure enough about my own songs yet at the time. But, I figured, well, they're not going to want to hear my original stuff. I should be more like in the line of the way Folkways is, you know, and do traditional songs and blues and country and that sort of thing, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why the first Folkways album didn't have any of my own songs on it. And so I sent them a cassette tape, and they sent me back a one-page contract with a check for $250. Because I think they figured, you know, I mean, it's Folkways. You know, they were famous for doing all these field recordings and all this kind of stuff. You know, it wasn't about the sound quality necessarily.
Right.
But then a friend of my dad's, who's an attorney, who's a civil rights attorney from Jackson, Mississippi, an old family friend, he had a client. He turned out he was an engineer at Malaco Studios in Jackson, and so this friend of my dad's, Tom Royals, he said, "Well, I think I can get us an afternoon in the studio at Malaco." And I said, okay. And so he set that up. And I brought this guitar player from Houston who I'd been playing with for a while, John Gramado.
Mm-hmm.
And we drove down to Jackson, Mississippi, and Tom put us up at his house, and we cut that Folkways album in an afternoon.
Oh,
you know. So that's the story behind that. Then I would eventually, you know, ended up back in Houston and eventually did that second Folkways album.
Yeah.
You know, so, but yeah, it was unusual. Oh yeah, on the second album, they gave me a check for $500.
Moving up in the world. There you go.
I moved up. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's.
But anyway, so, you know.
That's rad. So you put out those records, you start to build a name for yourself. You kind of reach this point, from what I can tell, in like the late 80s, early 90s, where you're still trying to push the rock up the hill of trying to get national recognition for your music. But at the same time, there's many artists inside of the music industry that become devotees of your music. Tom Petty, Emmylou Harris, Steve Earle, and then most significantly, Mary Chapin Carpenter, who would record your song Passionate Kisses, which became like a smash hit, which won you a Grammy. What did it feel like to get that sort of recognition after working so hard for so long?
It was pretty mind-blowing. I mean, I remember when I was, at that point, I was living in Nashville. I moved to LA in 1984 and, you know, eventually got signed to Rough Trade Records, and they were the only label who would sign me. Literally, I had interest from all these labels, you know, kind of, they were all kind of sniffing around, you know, during the time I was in LA, and, you know, there was a buzz, and they would come out to see me play, and we'd have meetings and that kind of thing, and they would tell me things like my songs didn't have bridges and that sort of thing, you know. I mean, they didn't know what to do with me because my stuff fell in the cracks between country and rock, you know.
Right.
Famous last words, which is now called Americana, but they didn't have that then.
Right.
So they didn't know what to do with me. And Rough Trade came along, and of course they were a European label, and you know how the Europeans are. They're much more open about things and not as concerned about whether it's going to get played on the radio and that sort of thing, you know. So they really saved me. They picked me up and, you know, signed me, and I did that record, and they sent me to Europe to tour, and I mean, it was a whole, you know, they really opened the door.
Wow.
You know. And then I moved to Nashville. There was a big earthquake in LA.
Oh, wow.
Around 1990 or 91, whatever it was, and a bunch of people, there was an exodus out of LA. After that, a lot of musicians headed for Nashville. This is when, you know, people are just looking for places to go besides LA and New York, you know, and things were getting more expensive and more expensive. And so everybody was either living in Nashville or Austin at that point almost. So, so I decided to give Nashville a try, you know, moved there. And let's see. Oh, yeah, I did a tour with Mary Chapin and Roseanne Cash. The three of us went to Australia. I did a Riders in the Round tour, acoustic thing. And that's when Chapin, that's what everybody calls her, she had been performing live. She had been doing my song Passionate Kisses. And, you know, she asked me, she wanted my blessing, you know, she could record it. And of course I said yes.
Right.
And, you know, she said, well, I just wanted your blessing. And I said, well, you have it, you know. And so she recorded it. Then when her album came out, her record company, she wanted to release Passionate Kisses as the first single. And they actually said no, because they said it wasn't country enough. And you can see where this is going.
Right.
So Chapin said, well, you know, the heck with that. I want it to be the first single because my fans love the song, and I've been playing it a lot live in my shows. And so then they relented, and they said, okay. And then it came out as a single, and that's when it won the Grammy for Country Song of the Year, which completely blew my mind. And I'm sure everybody else is on Music Row in Nashville. And it wasn't a country song at all. And I had just moved to town, and, you know, nobody knew who I was. And I wasn't one of the Nashville, you know, Music Row songwriter people, you know.
Right.
So this all came out of left field, you know.
Yeah.
And but I always, to this day, whenever I do that song live, I always tell people this story. I tell the audience about this, you know, and I thank Mary Chapin Carpenter from the bottom of my heart, you know, because she stood her ground and she fought her label.
Yeah.
You know.
You know, her asking...
She was having a challenge, too, because they were trying to promote her as a country artist, and she wasn't country, you know, and it just... The whole label thing is just so ridiculous.
Yeah, that was a different time. It's just not... It seems like labels just had so much more control over creative output back then than they do now.
Yeah, well, there are more indie labels now, and, you know, I think that's a lot of what that is.
Yeah.
You know, and now you've got the Americana market, so they can put you in there, you know.
Sure.
It's kind of become the place where you go when you don't fit in anywhere.
Right. It's a catch-all. So how did that song, the release of that song and the success of it, how did that change your professional life at that point?
Well, you know, it's huge when that happens. I mean, it's like a little gold sticker, you know, that is there, and, you know, everybody sees, and it just adds to your, you know, adds to whatever you're doing. You know, and I mean, it's real important. Anybody who says winning an award like a Grammy doesn't mean anything is they've either won one and they're just being modest, or, you know, they haven't won one and they're mad because they haven't won one or something.
Right,
you know?
yeah, just sour grapes.
Because it is a big deal.
Yes.
It's a huge deal. And, you know, to get any kind of acknowledgement, you know, like that, on that level, or anything, any kind of acknowledgement along the way, it's always important, and it feels great.
No,
you know,
indeed.
And, you know, it absolutely helps your career. You know,
Indeed.
It just kind of makes people pay more attention. You know, look, this person won a Grammy, you know, like,
yes,
you know, so.
Yes, it's the one thing that comes before.
Pay more attention, and What's that?
I was going to say it's the one thing that comes before your name in a biography from then on, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like when I get introduced a lot of times at things,
Yeah.
you know, one of the things they always say is, you know, winner of 3 Grammys, you know,
Yeah.
like, you know, that's a big thing. So, but anyway, I was kind of scared too. And I didn't know what to think about, and I was intimidated about going to the awards show, and just the whole thing just kind of freaked me out. So I ended up not actually going to the Grammys because I was all planned on going. I had my flight booked and everything, and I was just so scared and insecure, like, you know, looking at myself and going, how am I gonna? What's it gonna be? Of course, it ends up. It's not that. I mean, once you go to those things, you know, it seems like it's going to be real intimidating, and everybody's dressed to the nines, and you know, all that stuff. But you know, it turns out to be, you can really wear whatever you want to wear, and you know, you don't have to take part in all the hoopla stuff if you don't want to, you know.
As you heard, Lucinda Williams was exceptionally close to her father, a celebrated poet. And if you're a regular listener to this show, you know that I often choose selections of poetry to accompany the stories of our guests. Sometimes it's hard to decide which poet to include, but this week, obviously, it's a no-brainer. Here is a Miller Williams poem that takes a sober, wry, and southern look at America, entitled Of History and Hope. We have memorized America, how it was born and who we have been and where. In ceremonies and silence, we say the words, telling the stories, singing the old songs. We like the places they take us. Mostly we do. The great and all the anonymous dead are there. We know the sound of all the sounds we brought. The rich taste of it is on our tongues. But where are we going to be, and why, and who? The disenfranchised dead want to know. We mean to be the people we meant to be, to keep on going where we meant to go. But how do we fashion the future? Who can say how except in the minds of those who will call it now? The children. The children. And how does our garden grow? With waving hands, oh rarely in a row, and flowering faces, and brambles that we can no longer allow. Who were many people coming together cannot become one people falling apart. Who dreamed for every child an even chance cannot let luck alone turn doorknobs or not. Whose law was never so much of the hand as the head cannot let chaos make its way to the heart. Who have seen learning struggle from teacher to child cannot let ignorance spread itself like rot. We know what we have done and what we have said, and how we have grown, degree by slow degree, believing ourselves towards all we have tried to become, just and compassionate, equal, able, and free. All this in the hands of children, eyes already set on a land we can never visit. It isn't there yet. But looking through their eyes, we can see what our long gift to them may come to be. If we can truly remember, they will not forget. After that, you put out what would be considered, I think by most people, and probably by you as well, Car Wheels on a Gravel Road, which was like your breakthrough album where you kind of go to being like a household name for people. Can you kind of describe the making of that album and how it came together? Was it different in the way that you had approached other albums, or was it kind of the same and it just hit?
Well, you know, before that, there was the Sweet Old World one, which, and at that point I was, with the Rough Trade and the Sweet Old World and Car Wheels, I was working with the same band, and so we had a real tight bond, and Gerf Morlix was my guitar player, and we did all those albums together. We went and started working on Car Wheels, and we started in Austin at the studio there. And at some point, I was getting frustrated with some of the tracks, and they didn't feel right, and I wanted to recut a couple things that Gerf didn't agree, and we just started butting heads, and I think it was growing pains kind of thing, just like a relationship.
Yeah.
When we first got together, I was real naive, and he was kind of he kind of became the band leader and everything, and and then, but I didn't realize that he, because now what he's doing is his own thing, writing songs and all. Mm-hmm. I had no idea that that's really what he wanted to do, and he was writing songs, and he would show them to me, and he wanted to record some of his songs, and that kind of thing, and I didn't want to, and it was kind of, he was trying to grow into more of he didn't want to just be the guitar player in the band.
Right.
And so I think that's kind of, that was part of it,
Yeah.
And I was starting to get restless and wanted to kind of branch out more creatively. And I felt like when we were making Car Wheels at first, when we first went in, that we were just making another Sweeter World.
Right.
It's kind of sounding the same. And, so we took a break, and during that break was when Steve Earle invited me into the studio to sing on his album, on that song, You're Still Standing There.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I got to know Steve and met Ray Kennedy, who was working with Steve as the engineer. And they had their own studio called Room and Board on Music Row in Nashville. And anyway, in the process of doing all that, I heard Steve's, well, first of all, I was real impressed with the sound that Ray Kennedy was getting in the studio.
Mm-hmm.
And then Steve gave me a copy of his rough mixes, which I listened to and really liked the sound of.
Mm-hmm.
It had the songs, there was just a lot more compression in the vocals, and it was just, I just liked it. And we had, at that point, Steve had his rough mixes, and I had my rough mixes for Car Wheels. We'd gotten to that point where we had roughs of all the songs for Car Wheels, mm-hmm. but I wasn't happy with everything. And then Gerf came back in. We were going to get started again, and I played Steve's roughs for Gerf, and he didn't like them.
Mm-hmm.
He said, he didn't like them at all. And I said, well, I do. And this is how I want my album to sound. So, it's kind of just, it's just pretty simple. I wanted my album to sound a certain way. Gerf didn't agree. And so I wanted, to go. Steve invited me to come in with him and Ray Kennedy and cut a couple of tracks, because I wanted to recut some tracks. I wasn't happy with some of the tracks that we'd done, mm-hmm. that I'd done with Gerf. And it was just going to be a simple matter of just going in and recutting a couple of things.
Right.
Which Gerf was not happy about at all. And then we got in there, and it started sounding so good, we just ended up recutting everything. Wow. And that's the story in a nutshell. And then, Gerf wasn't happy, and, he still won't speak to me to this day. So.
Wow.
That was the hardest thing. Oh, yeah. It just completely severed our friendship.
Mm.
Not my choice. But he just, I don't know. It just doesn't make any sense. He just still carries that around. So
You mentioned earlier that, when you first began that relationship, you were more naive. He was more experienced. And in my experience in
yeah,
life, it's really hard to take a relationship where you begin as the person with like a little bit less power or knowledge. And then when you want to come up and kind of be on the same level as that other person, it doesn't always work out
yeah,
in the relationship,
yeah. That's true. Yeah, yeah.
But you really,
It surprised me. It surprised me that all that went down.
but you made the right decision creatively, though, as hard as
Yeah.
it was.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Gerf will still argue that fact to this day that the rough mixes are better.
Hmm.
I mean, it's just, but yeah, I made the right decision.
I want to talk about your new record, Good Souls and Better Angels. You said something about this record earlier in the press cycle that I thought was really interesting. You mentioned that the devil comes into play quite a bit in the lyrics for the record. You could search the world over and find a lot of definitions of the devil or of evil. How would you describe it yourself?
Wow, that's kind of a hard question because it's hard to describe, which is why I write songs.
Why you do it in songs? Yeah, I feel you. No, I
You
feel you.
mean how would I describe the devil or?
Well, let's put it this way.
That,
Let me rephrase the question for you then. Why do you
okay.
think that was? Why do you think that was a recurring subject in this record? Where do you think that came from?
Right. Well, I've always been fascinated with sort of the whole concept of good and evil, and God and the devil and all of that. And it shows up so much in a lot of old, blues songs. I mean, the blues, it's all over the place. And old, mountain songs, really early traditional folk music and, and this whole, and then the artwork. I also collect folk art, but I love outsider art, and there's a lot of that there, and it's just, I think it's just a constant, it's just the imagery of it, and I don't know, I like the sort of that concept of, the devil being, you can, put him in different forms or, it can actually be a person. Like there's this cool old blues song I discovered a few years ago, Don't Let the Devil Ride.
Mm.
And it's, it's a real cool, very primitive sounding Delta blues song that says, it's kind of like you're in a car going down the road and the devil's a hitchhiker.
Mm.
It's kind of, that's a picture that it conjures up, and it says, don't let the devil ride. If you let him ride, he'll steal your soul, that kind of thing. And I don't know, it's just, it's hard to explain why I'm drawn to that, but maybe because, both my grandfathers were Methodist ministers, and I've always been interested in, and probably if I'd stayed in college, I would have studied comparative religion, because I'm really interested in that and different, parts of it, and just the whole, it's just, I don't know.
Well, no, I shouldn't have asked such a broad question like that, because you're right.
Question.
No, but you do answer it in your songs, and I don't think artists should be responsible for saying anything outside. You say what you want to say within the two.
That's okay. I understand, but I guess I'm not. I feel like if for those who listen, who are have listened to older music like blues and early folk music and mountain music and all that, that you would hear that and that kind of music, which is the stuff that I was, inspired by. So.
Indeed. So these days when it comes to writing for this most recent album, What does your creative process look like for you on a day-to-day basis, and how has that changed over the years, if it has at all?
Well, I'm not I'm not real disciplined in terms of, some writers will tell you they set their clock and they get up and they start writing and they write from 10 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon every day, and, that kind of thing. I've never done, that's not me, which isn't to say that I'm not constantly, coming up with lines and ideas and that sort of thing. My brain never turns off, So I'm always, looking and thinking and writing stuff down and saving all these lines and bits and pieces of things,
Mm-hmm.
And I've got songs that are in various stages of being completed, and half finished or almost finished, and that I carry around with me I finally I had so many, I had to start filing them. I've got them in this big briefcase. And then when I get ready to sit down and apply myself, and I don't know what, that's another kind of mysterious thing, and the muse hits me. I get all that, get my briefcase and start pulling stuff out and, look at what I've got. Because I can have a song that I've been working on for a few years that I haven't been able to finish, and all of a sudden I'll be able to finish it, So, and then I'll have new ideas, so there's never a lack of inspiration or ideas or anything. It's just that I don't worry about trying to write a certain number of songs a week or a month, or, I used to. When I was younger, it used to freak me out. I used to think, oh, I've got writer's block, I haven't written anything new in however long. And then I realized, I would end up writing, it just was my own, everybody has their own, way that they do things. Because for me, once I get in the flow of it, then that's all I'll do for 2 or 3 weeks. I'll just write steadily, like I get in that mode, and then I'll come up with 10 or 12 songs.
Wow.
From older songs that I've started, that I finished, or brand new songs, that sort of thing. So,
has writing become easier for you as you get more experience, or has it remained the same?
I think it's gotten easier. Yeah, somewhat. I mean, I'm probably just a little bit more sure of myself, as a songwriter. And, I think what changes really, I think, is the subject matter, because, I mean, you can't keep writing about unrequited love forever.
Right.
Unless you're going to stay single and sad and miserable for your whole entire life.
Right.
So, I've been branching out. That's one reason that, you see this last record I did. Because it's a result of having, started these songs about, social unrest, which I've I've dug into before. It probably is starting with the Blessed album, because that was around the time that Tom and I got engaged and got married and everything. And I remember when Little Honey came out, that was when everybody found out that we gotten engaged, and I was doing interviews for that album. And I was asked, a couple of people asked me and said, well, the fans, everybody's wondering, are you still going to be able to write songs?
Wow.
And I just about dropped the phone. I said, what do you mean? Am I still going to be able to write songs? Because I'm engaged, I'm going to get married, so now I can't write anymore.
Right.
I mean, it was just so ridiculous.
Yeah.
And so then when the Blessed album, when I was writing songs for that, I took it on as a challenge almost. Like, you know, yes, I could still write songs, you know. Right. I just have to branch out a little bit and look at different subjects to write about, which I want to do anyway.
Right.
You know, I've been wanting to do that anyway, in the same way that Bob Dylan did, you know. He wrote about a lot of different stuff besides, you know, love songs. Like that song Hurricane, and, you know, and I've always wanted to do that. So this just kind of propels me in that direction, you know.
Yeah, indeed. Do you typically write with a guitar in your hands, or are you mainly, you got your pen and your page, an idea of the melody, and you're attacking the lyrics?
Yeah. Well, if I'm just kind of, you know, like in between when I'm not actually sitting down and working on stuff, you know, then I just write, you know, with a pen and a paper. Like the other day I had some ideas and I jotted them down. I was in the kitchen and, you know, I've been doing that lately, which is a good sign. That means, you know, I'm getting close to something. The time to write is approaching, you know, so... Mm-hmm. But anyway, when I get ready to actually sit down and work on stuff, then, yeah, I get my guitar out, you know. Then I've already got a bunch of, I'm not, you know, just looking at a blank page. You know, I've already got a bunch of lyrics that I've already written down. So, you know, I can try to start coming up with some melodies. And then, you know, I usually have I start with some lyrics at least, and then kind of mess around with those with my guitar and kind of try to come up with some kind of melody thing, you know. And then once I get that, then, you know, once I've got the structure for the song, then I could just go back in and fill in the rest of the lyrics.
Yeah.
You know, and then I just work on editing it, you know, kind of making it better. I probably learned that a lot from my dad because he was a great editor, you know.
Did he explicitly teach you editing, or did you just watch him working on his own stuff?
No, I just picked it up, you know, just picked up on stuff, and from talking to him and listening, I would sit in sometimes. He would have these writing workshops, and, you know, we would talk about writing a lot, and, you know, I just understood how he worked. You know, and the kind of person he was and the way he looked at things. He was really into the, you know, the economics of writing, you know.
So he would try to shorten things that he had written, and is that sort of the same thing that you do? Or?
He taught me about not using, yeah, I guess. I mean, he has some poems that are longer ones, but, I mean, I think it was just a matter of, you know, not getting too wordy and not getting too bogged down with things. And I don't know. He wasn't a big fan of Allen Ginsberg's, you know,
yeah,
the 5-hour poem or whatever it is, you know.
Mm-hmm.
My dad was more just, he wanted his poems to be able to be understood by everyone and not look like this big mystery that you have to figure out.
Yes.
You know, and that was a big thing he taught me, you know, not to be, he didn't want to come across as an elitist,
mm-hmm.
you know, and so I think I brought that with me into my songwriting, you know.
Yeah, that really puts a smile on my face to think of, you know, your father's influence still kind of coming through in your day-to-day creative life. That's a beautiful thing.
We're so bonded. I mean, I'm so much like my dad, you know.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Well, Miss Lucinda Williams, thank you so much for being a part of the Working Songwriter podcast.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed this.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.
That's our show for this week. It was brought to you by Bandzoogle. Built by musicians and for musicians, Bandzoogle is an all-in-one platform to build a beautiful website for your music. Use promo code TWS, the initials of our podcast, TWS, to get 15% off the first year of any subscription. Lucinda Williams' latest album is entitled Good Souls, Better Angels, available everywhere music is sold or streamed. If before we meet again, you sit down to write, please remember, an expensive drug habit is not a song, a compelling Instagram account is not a song, and most importantly, reverb is not a song. So let all that take care of itself, and for you, just keep your eye on the song.